They knew JD Vance would get mad when they told him to leave. When he spoke, everyone in the restaurant went silent. In the middle of Springfield, Ohio, JD Vance pulled into the parking lot of Owen's Diner. It was a simple place. It looked like it had been there for a long time, as the bright sign blinked a little. Every time someone came or went, the smell of grilled burgers and fresh coffee got through the door crack. Early that day, a local told him about it. That person swore by their homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries. He was worn out. He was tired from all the meetings, handshakes, and policy talks he had all day. All he wanted was a quiet meal before the drive home. As he walked in, the bell above the door rang. That's how it felt at first. The space was small but friendly. The kind of diner where the same few regulars sat in the same seats every night, and where a wall of faded Polaroids by the register showed staff and customers from decades ago. The room was filled with the low hum of talk and the smell of bacon grease and freshly brewed coffee. JD caught the hostess's eye from behind the bar. A smile was on her face when she saw him. He saw it even though it was only a second long, like when someone suddenly doesn't know what to do and a hesitation flashes across their face. She made a thin line with her lips. He took a quick look. A few customers looked in his direction. A man leaned in and whispered something to the person across from him while he was still halfway through his burger. Another person, a woman in a plaid shirt, dropped her coffee cup a little too quickly. Her eyes narrowed just a bit before she looked away. JD wasn't gullible. As a diner, he knew when he wasn't quite welcome because he'd been in enough places. Hey. The hostess thought for a moment, then took a step forward and tucked her hair behind her ear. Good evening, she said slowly. Are you going to eat in or get takeout? JD asked with a tired laugh. Dining in, if that's okay. There was another pause that was too long for a simple question. Actually? She looked to the kitchen over her shoulder and then back at him. I need to quickly check something. Moment, she said, and then she walked out the door that swung open. JD was left standing there. A few more people looked at him. At the bar, a man moved around in his seat. Someone said something under their breath, which meant that something wasn't right. The second one got longer. Voices that were too faint to make out came from behind the kitchen doors and came and went. JD slowly let out a breath and rolled his shoulders back. He wasn't going to make a fuss. He also wasn't going to guess anything. There could have been a rule or not enough help. The waitress may have come back. It wasn't like she wasn't sure this time. She seemed good to go. I'm sorry, sir, she said with more force. We can't serve you tonight, she said, but the way she said it, and the way the room seemed to get quiet around her, made it clear this wasn't a business meeting. The tone was private. JD Vance didn't say anything for a short time. It was like the words didn't need to be explained. They just sat there between them, thick and heavy. It wasn't dead quiet, but it was pretty quiet. There was still the buzzing sound of the grill in the back and the scraping of a fork against a plate, but there wasn't as much talk as there usually is. People were waiting and watching. JD looked at the hostess's face. While not mean, she seemed firm, as if she had already made up her mind. It could have been someone else who made it up for her. He looked past her and into the kitchen window. Just past the bar, two cooks stood, half hidden behind a heat lamp with plates stacked on top of it. Their words were hard to understand. He shook his head. This time, the waitress didn't move around. She said, I'm sorry, did I do something wrong? It's just... JD put his hands on his hips and let out a breath through his nose. We'd rather not serve you tonight. No policy, no we're closing soon, just that. There had been times when he felt uncomfortable, like in political discussions or interviews that were meant to trip him up. but being turned away from a simple roadside diner was different. A cough broke the silence. When JD turned a little, he saw an older man sitting next to the bar looking at him. The man's blue work jacket was torn at the edges and his hands were worn from years of hard work. It looked like he had been coming here for years. The only person who heard him was himself, shaking his head. Then he stabbed the last of his eggs. A woman in a booth across from me moved around in her seat, but I couldn't read her face. A guy in his 30s or younger leaned back and crossed his arms across from her, as if he was enjoying the show. JD saw everything. The eyes that turned away as soon as they met his, the ones that stayed on him for too long, and the ones that held something sharper and more satisfying. He could feel how heavy the moment was at that very moment. It was up to him. He could leave, shake his head, and forget about it. He could ask them to explain, name them, and see if they knew what this would look like on the morning news. He could challenge them directly and see if they would stick to their choice once they knew they were turning down a U.S. senator. He didn't do any of those things. Instead, he slowly nodded and said, "Okay." His voice was steady and even. "May I talk to the manager?" That caught some people off guard. The hostess paused again and looked toward the kitchen as if she wanted to ask for permission to be quiet. Something was said under the older man's breath at the desk. Someone close to the window laughed quickly as if they couldn't believe he was really going to do this. JD didn't do anything but wait. The lady left again, but this time she went out a different door. There were a few more beats of silence, a coffee sip, and the movement of a plate across the bar. The door then opened, and a guy in his early 50s walked out. He had broad shoulders and thick arms, crossed over an apron that was stained with grease. His name tag said Don. Don didn't ask JD what he wanted. He just gave him a quick look and said, "I hear you got a question." But the way he said it wasn't friendly. It wasn't even nice. The task was hard. Don's stare at JD Vance was steady and hard to read. He wasn't here to fight or show his strength, but he also wasn't going to leave without knowing why. "Yeah," replied JD. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Don let out a sharp breath through his nose, as if he knew the question was coming but wasn't ready to answer. He wiped his hands on his apron and looked at the few customers who were still watching the deal. A few people claimed not to hear. Some people didn't try to hide how interested they were. "Look," Don said as he moved his weight. JD raised an eyelid and said, "This ain't personal." The words made Don's jaw tighten. "Seems pretty personal." He finally let out a sigh as he rubbed the back of his neck. "People here have ideas about you and what you stand for. I have a business to run, and I don't want any trouble." JD slowly nodded, letting the words sink in. "And the fact that I'm eating is a problem?" Don didn't answer right away. After putting down his eggs, the old man in the work jacket went back to the bar and chewed a little more slowly. The younger man watched from a few seats away with his arms crossed as if it were the best thing he'd seen all week. JD had seen something like this before. It wasn't quite the same, but it was close. It wasn't just about making one choice, talked about what it meant, how it would look, and how people would feel about it. It was about the pressure that comes from everywhere and the standards that people don't say out loud that can make someone make decisions they aren't sure about. He turned around and looked at Don again. "Be honest with me. Do you agree with this, or is this just about keeping the peace?" Don paused and curled his fingers a little against his apron. JD saw something that almost looked like discomfort for the first time, as if Don wasn't sure about this as much as he wanted to seem. The younger man in the booth laughed sharply before the man could answer. "Oh, come on," he said with a sneer. JD looked at him for a moment before saying, This ain't that deep. You're just not welcome here. Simple as that. That guy looked like he liked a good fight and was just waiting for a chance to say something. JD didn't say anything. He only looked at Don again. Letting go is fine with me if that's what you want. The words hung there, giving Don a chance to take a breath, think again, and fight back against whatever set him off in the first place. Don looked briefly at the kitchen and then back at JD. Don finally said, "I just don't want things to get bad." JD said, "Yes, neither do I." They didn't say anything for a long time. JD could have left. He only had to shake his head, walk away, and never look back. Calling this into a news story would have been easy. Instead, he should have let the internet do its thing. He did something that no one thought he would do, though. After sitting down, he said, "Then let's talk." The room tightened up. The chair wasn't slammed down by JD. He didn't get louder or puff up his chest. He did nothing but sit there with his hands on the table, as if he had all the time in the world. What was going on was new to the diner. Arguments generally ended quickly when one side stormed off or shut down. That wasn't it, though. Don took a deep breath and looked at him for a long time. "Talk," he said over and over, as if the word didn't belong there. JD just shrugged. "I understand that you don't want me here. What I don't understand is why. Let's talk about it." The younger man in the booth let out a low laugh. "I told JD, man, this guy's got nerve." He didn't answer. Don pulled out the chair next to JD, but he didn't sit down. He instead put his arms against the back and leaned on it. That kind of flour that had been on his apron since the morning shift was still there. Don finally said, "I run a business. I don't want to start fights or make headlines, but I have a community to care about." And JD slowly nodded. "Okay, so tell me, what does this community think about me?" Don asked. He looked over his shoulder as if he were waiting for someone else to answer. Uncomfortably, the waitress behind the bar moved around. The man in the work jacket didn't look up, but his fork hadn't moved in a while. Don then turned around and looked back. "People here don't like politicians, don't trust them, and some of the things you've said, some of the things you've stood for, it doesn't sit right with folks." JD leaned back a little. "That's fine, but you don't know me, do you?" Don asked. "Not personally, no." "Then tell me," JD said. "If I was just some guy walking in here, not someone you've seen on TV, would we even be having this conversation?" No one spoke. JD let the silence last for a while and watched as Don's face changed a little. It wasn't a big change, but something had broken, even if it was only a little. The younger guy then laughed from the back of the room. JD turned to face him and said, "This isn't about TV, man. It's about people knowing who you really are." "And who am I?" the guy asked with a smile, finally getting the attention he was looking for. "You seem like someone who gets regular people, but you just play politics like everyone else," she said. JD slowly nodded, thinking about what she said. "All right," said he. "Then tell me, what do you think I should have done differently?" The man blinked. That wasn't the answer he was hoping for. JD went on, "You want me gone? Okay, you have the floor. Say what you want." The restaurant was now completely silent. Everything had stopped, even in the kitchen. There were no plates clinking or orders being called out. Don rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. He wasn't ready for this tonight. JD gave a tired little smile. It wasn't just about disagreement this time, everyone said. Me neither. It had to do with something else, something easier to understand. It wasn't just quiet in the diner now, it was looking at. Sneaky looks over their plates were seen by even those who claimed not to care. JD was calm as he waited. As he leaned back in his seat, the younger man looked like he was going to say something, but for the first time, he showed signs of hesitancy. When he might not have been defending himself because he knew JD wasn't arguing, he just stood there. Without letting go of the chair in front of him, Don finally let out a breath. He shook his head and said, "You want to know what people think? They believe you're not telling the truth," JD said. He barely tilted his head as if he were thinking about what was being said. "They think you talk about working class folks, but you still play the game. That you make promises like every other guy in a suit, but when it comes down to it, nothing changes." Don let out a breath. "And they don't forget." JD gave a slow nod. The younger man laughed and said, "I get that." JD looked at him and asked, "That's all you're going to say?" "What else do you want me to say?" the man asked as he stood up. "Man, I don't know. You should argue, defend yourself, say something." JD put his arms on the table and relaxed. "You knew what you thought about me before I even walked through that door. You wanted me to get mad and fight back so you could feel good about yourself." The guy's mouth opened a little, but nothing came out. JD went on, his voice steady. "But what if I told you I know exactly how that makes you feel?" He turned to look at Don. "You said that nothing changes. I know how you feel because I grew up seeing people around me fall behind. I even felt like I was falling behind. I went to school and did things no one thought I would do, but that doesn't mean I forgot." Don's fingers tapped against the chair, but he didn't look rude. He seemed to be thinking. He took a quick look around the diner. "You don't have to agree with me. I'm not here to change your minds. But I walked in here as a customer, not a politician. Just a guy looking for a meal." A quiet moment. From behind the bar, the old man in the work jacket said, "Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger." This made the tension just a little less intense. Some people laughed. Don even laughed a little and shook his head. JD looked at him again. Don let out a breath and ran his hand over his face. "So, what now?" The cooks were still watching from the kitchen, so he turned his attention back to JD. Don finally said, "I'll tell you what. You sit here and finish this conversation, and if by the end of it I don't think you're just another guy talking a good game, maybe, just maybe, I'll have my waitress bring you a menu." JD nodded, and there was a small smile on his face. It didn't feel like a split room for the first time that night since Sounds Like a Deal. It had the feel of something different, more like a talk. The diner's air was different now. Don's shoulders were not as stiff as they were before. The younger man in the booth was no longer grinning and was sitting up straight instead of leaning back as if this were a show. Even the customers who hadn't said anything and had just been watching seemed less sure of what they thought. JD leaned a little forward. "Okay," he said in a calm voice. "Come on, let's end this talk." Don let out a sigh and sat back down in the chair across from him. He didn't look tired from working a long shift. Instead, he looked tired from years of worrying that no one is listening to them and long-term demands. Don rubbed his hands together and said, "I'll be honest. I don't know if you're the guy people think you are. I don't know if you're really looking out for folks like us, or if you just know how to talk a good game." JD gave a smile. Don looked at him and said, "Fair enough. I do know that people here have long memories. They remember every time someone shook their hand, looked them in the eye, and said they'd do something but then left and never came back." JD tapped his knuckle on the table and thought. He then said, "I don't blame them for that." Don laughed and shook his head. "Nobody ever does that," they said. A beat went by. The old man in the work jacket then spoke again from behind the bar. "I worked in a factory for 35 years. 35 damn years." He set his coffee down with a soft thunk. I watched my neighbors lose their jobs, watched whole families pack up and leave because there wasn't anything left for them. Watched politicians show up, shake a few hands, tell us they understood, then drive back to wherever the hell they came from. JD met his eyes. And do you think I'm one of those politicians? The old man stared at him for a long time, then shrugged. I don't know, but I can tell you one thing. He pointed a calloused finger toward him. You're the only one who stuck around to listen? That landed. The waitress behind the counter shifted, glancing toward Don. The two cooks in the kitchen looked at each other. Even the younger man in the box, who had been criticizing the most, had nothing to say. JD waited for the silence to end. He then went back to Don. So, what's it gonna be? Don asked. He tapped his fingers on the table, looked into the kitchen, let out another breath, and then stood up. Mary, he told her behind the bar, get him a menu. A wave of surprise went through the diner. The younger man laughed, but he didn't say anything. Mary, the waitress, thought about what to do for a second before getting a printed menu and walking it over. JD took it and gave a small thank you nod. Appreciate it. Don shook his head, half amused and half shocked. JD smiled and opened the menu. I still don't know if I like you. That's all right. I don't need everyone to like me. Don let out a short chuckle, then turned toward the kitchen. All right, boys, fire up the grill. And just like that, what started as a refusal turned into something no one in that diner would forget. Not all the stress was gone, but it was gone enough. It's loud enough for the forks to hit the plates again, just enough for the low chatter to slowly start up again. JD sat in the seat with the menu in his hand, but he wasn't reading it. He was looking at Don, the old man behind the counter, and the younger man in the booth. The younger man still looked skeptical, but he wasn't grinning either. The diner started to feel like a diner again when JD finished his meal. People started talking again, plates hit the table, and coffee was poured again. People still thought what they thought. They were still not sure. One night in a small town, though, a different kind of talk took place. That might have been enough. When everyone is ready to yell, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay, listen, and show, even if only for a moment, that not everything needs to be a fight. As long as you're still reading, I have one question for you. Have you ever had to decide whether to leave or stay and listen? Post your ideas below. I look forward to hearing them. Don't forget to like, follow, and hit that bell if you thought this story was interesting. I'll be here to tell you another story whenever I have one. Until the next time.